My name is Nora Callahan. I am 31 years old, and the night that changed everything began with a birthday cake I never got to eat. I want you to picture something. You are driving to a restaurant where your family has gathered to celebrate your 30th birthday. You are running 12 minutes late because you stopped at a gas station to buy breath mints and fix your lipstick in the rearview mirror. You are smiling. You are happy. You have no idea that inside that restaurant, your entire world is about to be surgically dismantled in front of 75 people who share your last name. That was me, 365 days ago. I walked through those glass doors in a cream-colored dress I had saved up 3 weeks to buy. The room smelled like gardenias and expensive wine. Tables were draped in white linen, candles flickered. It looked exactly like the kind of birthday dinner you would dream about your whole life. But nobody was smiling. 75 people sat in complete silence, staring at me the way you stare at a car accident on the side of the highway. My mother was in the far corner, arms crossed, face unreadable. My father stood at the front of the room with a microphone in one hand, and in the other hand, he held a sealed manila envelope. My stomach dropped before my brain could explain why. Because deep down, somewhere beneath the perfume and the birthday dress and the nervous smile I was already forcing onto my face, I already knew. Whatever was inside that envelope was not a gift. Before I tell you what happened that night, I need you to understand who my parents were. Because none of what they did makes sense without the 29 years that came before it. My father, Conrad Callahan, built his money the old-fashioned way. He inherited it, protected it like a religion, and spent the better part of his adult life making sure everyone around him knew exactly how much of it he had. He was the kind of man who wore a watch that cost more than most people's cars, and who introduced himself by his full name at casual dinner parties, Conrad Douglas Callahan III. He said it with the same gravity other men reserved for eulogies. My mother, Diane, was quieter but sharper. She was the architect behind every social decision in our household. Which schools I attended, which friends were acceptable, which version of our family story got told at charity galas and country club lunches. She curated our life the way a museum curator arranges exhibits. Everything visible was intentional. Everything uncomfortable was hidden behind velvet ropes. I was their only child, their only daughter. At least, that was the story I had been told for 30 years. Growing up, Callahan meant growing up watched. Every report card was a referendum on the family name. Every stumble was a private catastrophe. I remember being 12 years old and crying in my bedroom after getting a B+ on a history exam. Not because I was disappointed in myself, but because I had already learned that disappointment in our house ran in one direction, downward, from them to me. I tried. God, I tried. I graduated from a university my father had handpicked. I interned at the firm he recommended. I dated the kind of men my mother described as appropriate. I folded myself into the shape they designed and called it growing up. But there was always something. A crack in the glass I could never quite explain. I noticed it first when I was 16. We were going through old photo albums at Christmas, the kind of rainy afternoon tradition that feels warm until it doesn't. I stumbled across a photograph I had never seen before. It was my parents, young and laughing at what looked like a hospital. My mother was holding a newborn. I assumed it was me, but the date on the back of the photograph read 18 months before I was born. I asked my mother about it. Her face went completely still. She took the photo from my hand, slid it beneath a stack of other albums, and said, "That was a neighbor's baby. We were visiting." Then she changed the subject so smoothly I almost believed her. Almost. I carried that image in the back of my mind for 14 years. I never asked again. I learned early that in the Callahan house, the questions you were not supposed to ask were exactly the ones that mattered most. By the time I was in my late 20s, I had built a quiet life that was mine. I worked as a landscape architect. I had a small apartment with too many plants and a rescue dog named Orwell, who had one floppy ear and a distrust of strangers that I deeply respected. I had a best friend named Priya, who had been in my corner since college, and I had a relationship with my parents that was functional, distant, and held together by obligatory Sunday phone calls and holiday appearances. I was not happy, but I was steady. Then, 2 weeks before my 30th birthday, my father called me on a Tuesday afternoon. He never called on Tuesdays. "We are hosting your birthday dinner," he said. No question, no invitation, a statement. "Dad, I was actually planning something small with friends." 75 people, he said. Family. People who love you. Nora, you are turning 30. This is important. I paused. Something in his voice was different, controlled in a way that felt rehearsed rather than natural. "Okay," I said. "Wear something appropriate," he added. Then he hung up. I stared at my phone for a long time after that call. Orwell put his head in my lap. I scratched his ear. And that photograph from the Christmas album surfaced in my memory like a warning I had no framework to decode. 2 weeks later, I walked into that restaurant, and the sealed manila envelope was waiting for me. The silence in that restaurant was the kind that has weight, the kind you feel pressing against your chest. I stood just inside the doorway for what felt like an entire minute but was probably 4 seconds. 75 faces turned toward me. Aunts, uncles, cousins, my parents' colleagues, family friends I had known my entire life. People who had watched me grow up. People who had given me birthday cards and Christmas gifts and graduation hugs. None of them were smiling. My cousin Becca, who I had been close to since childhood, was sitting near the entrance. She looked up at me when I walked in, and immediately looked down at the table. That small motion told me everything I needed to know. Something had already been said before I arrived. Whatever was happening, I was the last to know. My father stepped forward when he saw me. "Nora, come in. Sit down." His voice was steady, practiced. He gestured to a chair that had been placed slightly apart from the others, not at the head of the table, not surrounded by family, isolated, positioned like a witness stand. I did not move toward it. "Dad, what is going on?" "Sit down first. Tell me what is in that envelope first." People shifted in their seats. My mother stood near the window watching me with an expression I had never seen on her before. Not anger, not sadness. Something more clinical than either of those. Something that looked remarkably like calculation. I sat down. Not because I wanted to, but because my legs had stopped working correctly and the chair was closer than the door. My father cleared his throat and tapped the microphone once. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he began. "This is not easy for our family, but there are things that have been hidden for too long, and a man of integrity does not allow lies to continue simply because the truth is inconvenient." A man of integrity. I remember thinking that was a strange way to open a birthday dinner. He opened the manila envelope. Inside was a document, several pages, clipped together. He held it up briefly so the room could see it and then placed it on the table in front of me. "This is the result of a DNA test," he said. The room went completely still. Nora is not my biological daughter. I heard someone near the back of the room inhale sharply. My Aunt Patricia put her hand over her mouth. My cousin Marcus stared at the table. Nobody spoke. I looked at the document. I looked at my father. I looked at my mother, who had still not moved from her position by the window. "You had a DNA test done," I said slowly, without telling me. "We had it done 6 months ago," my father said, "and the results are conclusive." 6 months ago. I repeated the words out loud because saying them helped my brain process what they meant. "You have known for 6 months and you chose to tell me here. Tonight. In front of 75 people." He straightened his jacket. We felt it was important that the family understood the situation going forward. The situation, I said. The inheritance, my mother said from across the room. Her first words of the evening. Quiet, precise, and sharper than anything my father had said. The Callahan estate is substantial, Nora. We have a responsibility to ensure it passes correctly. And there it was. 30 years of birthdays and school plays and Sunday dinners and forced smiles at country club events. 30 years of being molded and managed and measured against a standard I never fully understood. It came down to an estate. A number. $500,000 and the Callahan name. I sat very still. I looked around the room at 75 people who were waiting to see what I would do. My hands were perfectly steady in my lap, because what none of them knew, not my father with his microphone, not my mother with her calculations, not a single person in that silent room, was that I had received my own envelope 6 days earlier, and mine told a very different story. Let me take you back 6 days before that dinner, because that is where the real story begins. It was a Thursday morning. I was at my drafting table working on a residential garden plan when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost did not answer. I was in the middle of a detailed schematic, and unknown numbers during work hours were almost always spam, but something made me pick up. Is this Nora Callahan? The voice was older, female, careful. It is. Who is this? My name is Helen Marsh. You do not know me, but I knew your mother. Your biological mother. I set my pencil down. I think you have the wrong person, I said, because that was the first thing my brain produced. I do not, she said. I was her closest friend for 11 years. Her name was Rosalind Vance. She passed away 4 years ago. Before she died, she gave me something to deliver to you. I have been trying to work up the courage to call for a long time. I am sorry it took me this long. I did not speak. I could not. My entire body had gone rigid. She left you a letter, Helen continued, and a document that she wanted you to have when the time was right. She told me the time would be right when the Callahans finally decided to use what they knew against you. She said they would eventually. She just did not know when. My hands started shaking. She knew the Callahans. She knew Conrad Callahan personally, Helen said, very personally. For a short period, a very long time ago. We met the following day. Helen Marsh was 73 years old, small-framed, white-haired, and she sat across from me in a quiet coffee shop with a sealed envelope on the table between us. She watched me with the particular gentleness of someone who has been carrying another person's grief for years. She told me what she knew. Rosalind Vance had been 24 years old when she met Conrad Callahan at an industry conference. She was a junior graphic designer. He was married, powerful, and apparently very persuasive. Their relationship lasted 8 months. When Rosalind discovered she was pregnant, Conrad ended things immediately. He provided money for silence and had his attorney draft documents ensuring Rosalind would never make any claim against him or the Callahan family. She signed. She was young and frightened and alone, but she did not terminate the pregnancy. She gave birth to a daughter. She named her briefly before the private adoption arrangements Conrad had quietly organized were completed. She handed her daughter to a couple she had never met and spent the next 3 decades trying to forgive herself for it. I was that daughter. Helen slid the envelope across the table. I opened it with hands that would not stop trembling. Inside was a letter written in careful, looping handwriting. 3 pages. A mother writing to a daughter she had never been allowed to know. She described her hair color, which was the same shade of brown as mine. She described her love of plants, which stopped my breath completely. She described the grief of not knowing if her daughter was safe or happy or loved. She described Conrad Callahan with a precision that left no room for ambiguity. She described the money he paid, the documents he drafted, the way he looked at her at the end of their last meeting, which was with the kind of relief a man feels when a problem has been solved rather than a life altered. At the bottom of the envelope, beneath the letter, was a document. A formal record of the private adoption, a financial transfer record showing payments from Conrad Callahan to a private attorney dated 31 years ago, and a handwritten note in the margin that said, "If Conrad ever tries to take what is yours, show them where it all began. He is not the only one with paperwork." I sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours after Helen left. I read the letter 4 times. I held the documents until my coffee went completely cold. Then I went home and started preparing for my birthday dinner. I had 6 days between Helen's phone call and the birthday dinner. 6 days to decide what to do with a truth that could detonate 30 years of carefully constructed Callahan mythology. I spent the first 2 days in a state of quiet paralysis. I sat in my apartment surrounded by my plants, Orwell at my feet, staring at the envelope Helen had given me. I did not cry. I was past crying. Something inside me had shifted into a strange, focused stillness that felt less like grief and more like clarity. On the 3rd day, I called Priya. I trust Priya with everything. She is the kind of friend who does not perform concern. She sits with you in the actual weight of a thing without trying to immediately fix it or soften it. I told her everything. Helen, Rosalind, the letter, the documents, the adoption records, Conrad's payments. When I finished, there was a long silence. "They called the birthday dinner already," Priya said, 2 days before Helen called me. "So they already had the DNA test. They already knew." "They have known for 6 months," I said. "They were planning this." Priya was quiet for another moment. "Nora, your biological mother said in that letter that he paid for silence once before. Now he is planning to use his version of the truth to strip you of inheritance rights. He wants to do it publicly, so the family witnesses it, so it cannot be challenged. I know. He thinks he controls the narrative." "He has controlled it his entire life," I said. "He controlled my mother. He controlled Rosalind. He controlled me. He has never once been in a room where the story did not go the way he planned it." "Then we need to make sure this room is different," Priya said. On the 4th day, I made a phone call that I had been afraid to make for 3 days. I called my family lawyer, a woman named Gloria Trent who I had retained 2 years earlier to handle my apartment lease and some minor financial matters. I told her what I had. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Nora, I need you to bring me everything. Today." Gloria spent 4 hours reviewing the documents Helen had given me. She made copies. She made calls. She had the composure of someone who had seen family wealth used as a weapon many times before. When she looked up from the last document, her expression was completely neutral. "This is substantial," she said. "The financial transfer records alone establish a direct connection between Conrad Callahan and the private adoption arrangement. Combined with the adoption record and the timeline, this creates a very clear picture of what happened." "Does it change my legal standing regarding the estate?" I asked. "The DNA test your father intends to use establishes that you are not his biological child. That is accurate. But here is what Conrad has not considered." She folded her hands on the desk. "The private adoption was arranged and financially facilitated by Conrad himself. That means he knowingly brought you into his family. He and Diane legally adopted you, Nora. That legal relationship does not dissolve based on biology. It was created by documentation, and documentation works both ways. He cannot undo it. Not without a legal process that would require him to acknowledge publicly what he paid for 31 years ago." I leaned back in my chair. Something warm and electric moved through my chest. It was not anger exactly. It was something cleaner than anger. It was the feeling of a door swinging open after a very long time. On the 5th day, I found out about the camera. My cousin Marcus, who had a guilty conscience and the emotional transparency of a golden retriever, texted me in the evening. His message said, "Nora, I don't know what is happening, but your dad hired someone to film the dinner. I thought you should know. Please don't tell anyone I told you." I read that text 3 times. My father was not just planning to humiliate me in front of family. He was planning to document it. I made one more phone call that night. The phone call I made on the 5th night was to a man named Douglas Reeve. I need to explain who Douglas Reeve is, because his presence at that dinner was the single thing my father never anticipated and could never have prepared for. Douglas Reeve was 64 years old. He was a retired investigative journalist who had spent 30 years covering financial fraud, corporate misconduct, and the particular kind of damage that powerful men inflict on people they consider beneath accountability. He had broken 4 major stories in his career, one of which had resulted in a federal investigation. He was sharp, quiet, and he had a memory like a steel trap. He was also Rosalind Vance's older brother. Helen had mentioned him briefly during our meeting. She had said that Douglas had spent years trying to find out what happened to his sister's child, that he had never stopped being angry about what Conrad Callahan had done, that Rosalind had specifically asked him in her final weeks not to do anything rash. He had honored her wishes. For 4 years, he had stayed quiet. When I called him, he picked up on the second ring. "I wondered if you would ever call," he said. "You knew about me?" "Rosalind told me everything before she died. She made me promise to stay out of it unless you came to me. She did not want to force herself into your life from beyond the grave. She said if you ever called, then you were ready." "I am ready," I said. There was a pause. "What do you need?" I told him about the dinner, the microphone, the 75 guests, the manila envelope, the camera crew my father had arranged. Then I told him what I had learned from Gloria. About the adoption records, about the financial transfers, about the fact that Conrad Callahan had not just abandoned his biological daughter. He had orchestrated her disappearance, paid for it, documented it, and then spent 31 years building a family around the lie. Douglas was quiet for a long moment. "He hired a camera crew," Douglas said. "He wanted this on film." "Yes." "Then he is going to get exactly what he wanted," Douglas said, "just not the version he planned." Douglas arrived at the restaurant 40 minutes before I did. He came as a guest, introduced by my cousin Becca, who I had quietly contacted the day before. Becca was one of the few family members I trusted, and when I explained what was happening, she sat in complete silence for 90 seconds and then said, "Tell me what you need me to do." Becca seated Douglas near the front of the room, close to the microphone, close to my father. I arrived 12 minutes late, on purpose. I had dressed carefully that morning, the cream dress, my mother's pearl earrings, which she had given me at my 16th birthday, and which I wore now with a deliberate and specific intention. My hair was down. I looked exactly the way my parents would have wanted me to look at an event meant to humiliate me, polished, presentable, and completely unaware. That last part was the performance. When I walked through those glass doors and saw the room, saw the silence, saw the isolated chair positioned like a witness stand, saw my father with his microphone and his manila envelope, I understood the full architecture of what he had constructed. He had turned my birthday dinner into a tribunal. He had invited an audience. He had arranged documentation. He had done all of this assuming I would walk in uninformed and unprepared. That I would sit in that chair. That I would absorb the revelation in real time with nowhere to go and nothing to say. That 75 witnesses would see Conrad Callahan deliver the truth and walk away from it looking righteous. He had done all of this without knowing that on a Thursday morning 6 days earlier, a woman named Helen Marsh had placed an envelope on a coffee shop table. My father believed he was holding all the cards. He had not yet noticed Douglas Reeve sitting in the 3rd row. My father's voice carried well in that restaurant. He had clearly practiced. He laid out his version of events with the precision of a man who had rehearsed it. The DNA test, the results, the language about integrity and truth, and the responsibility of the Callahan name. He spoke about the estate. He used the word legitimate 3 times. He never once looked at me the way a father looks at a daughter. He looked at me the way a man looks at a closing argument. When he finished, the room was absolutely still. I could feel 74 sets of eyes waiting to see me collapse. I did not collapse. I stood up. "Thank you, Dad," I said. My voice was completely level. "I appreciate you sharing your version of events. Now I would like to share mine." A murmur moved through the room. My father's jaw tightened. "Nora, we can discuss the details privately." "You hired a camera crew," I said. "You invited 75 people. You chose this room and this night to tell me who I am not. I think it is only fair that the same room and the same camera hear who I actually am." I reached into my bag and pulled out my own envelope. Not manila. White. Thick. My mother made a small sound across the room. She recognized the kind of envelope a lawyer sends. "6 months ago," I said, "you had a DNA test done without my knowledge. You discovered that you are not my biological father. That is true. You are correct." I paused. "What you did not know is that I have spent the last 6 days learning exactly what that means." I opened the envelope. I held up the adoption record. 31 years ago, you privately arranged the adoption of a newborn girl through a private attorney named Walter Grimes. You paid for this arrangement personally. I have the financial transfer records. I have the adoption documentation. I have everything." My father's face went the color of old paper. "This document," I said, holding up the formal legal adoption record, "shows that you and Diane Callahan legally adopted me. Fully. Completely. That legal relationship does not dissolve because of biology. Your attorney will tell you this. Mine already has." A woman near the back of the room said something under her breath. My Aunt Patricia had tears running down her face. Not sad tears, the kind that come from watching something overdue finally happen. My father found his voice. "Whatever documents you have were obtained fraudulently. Your biological mother signed away all rights. There is nothing there that changes." "My biological mother." I said it quietly. "Her name was Rosalind Vance. She was 24 years old when you ended your relationship with her because she became inconvenient. She signed documents you had drafted because she was alone and frightened and you were powerful. She spent 31 years missing a daughter she never got to know. She died 4 years ago." I looked at my father with a steadiness I had not known I possessed until this moment. "She was not a problem you solved. She was a person." The camera operator near the side wall had stopped moving. He was staring at me. My father opened his mouth. And then Douglas Reeve stood up. The room shifted. People turned. Douglas did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "My name is Douglas Reeve," he said. "I was an investigative journalist for 30 years. I am also Rosalind Vance's brother, and this young woman's biological uncle." He reached into his jacket. "I have spent 4 years honoring my sister's request to stay quiet. I have documentation of the financial arrangement Conrad Callahan made in 1993. I have email correspondence from as recently as 2 years ago in which Conrad's attorney referenced, and I am quoting directly here, the ongoing necessity of keeping the Vance matter private." He placed a folder on the nearest table. "I also have a contact at 3 regional news outlets who are already aware that something newsworthy might be occurring tonight. I came here hoping Conrad would do the right thing. He has not. So I am doing it for him." The restaurant had gone so silent I could hear the candles. My father sat down. What happened in the 20 minutes after Douglas stood up was the kind of controlled unraveling that I will spend the rest of my life replaying in quiet moments. My father tried to recover. That was the first thing he did. Conrad Callahan had been the most powerful person in every room he had ever entered, and his instinct, when challenged, was to assert dominance rather than retreat. He tried to dismiss Douglas. He called him a grieving relative with an agenda. He said the documents were fabricated. He said Rosalind Vance had been compensated fairly and had made her choices as an adult. Every word he said made it worse, because the camera was still running. My father had hired a videographer to document his triumph, and that videographer, a young man of about 25 who was clearly starting to understand what he had walked into, kept the camera rolling out of what I can only describe as professional instinct and personal fascination. My mother spoke for the second time that evening. She walked to the front of the room and placed her hand on my father's arm. "Conrad," she said quietly, "stop." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that I had never seen there before. It looked like fear. My mother turned to the room. She did not have a microphone. She did not need one. "I have known about Rosalind Vance since the second year of our marriage," she said. Her voice was measured and flat. "Conrad told me. He told me in a way that was designed to make me feel grateful for his honesty rather than betrayed by his history. He said it was handled. He said Rosalind had signed documents. He said the child had a family." She stopped. "I accepted that because I was 28 years old, and I wanted my marriage to work. I have spent 30 years accepting things I should not have accepted. I am done." The room was in a state of suspended disbelief, mouths open, drinks untouched. My mother looked at me directly. "I want you to know that I have loved you. Whatever you believe about me and whatever you decide going forward, that part has been real. I did not know he was planning this dinner. He told me it was a celebration. I found out what it actually was 3 days ago, and I did not stop it because I thought perhaps it was time for the truth. I did not anticipate that you already had it." She picked up her purse. She looked at my father one final time. "I will be at the house with my attorney in the morning," she said. Then she walked out of the restaurant. My father stood at the front of the room completely alone with a microphone he no longer seemed to know what to do with. Douglas was speaking quietly with several of my relatives near the side of the room. He placed his folder on the table in a way that suggested it would remain there regardless of what anyone preferred. I walked to where my father was standing. He was not the imposing, controlled figure who had greeted me at the door. He looked exactly like what he was. A man who had arranged a performance that had turned catastrophically against him. A man who had spent his entire life believing that enough money and enough silence could bury anything. "Why tonight?" I asked. "Why like this?" He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "The estate goes to trust next year if there is no direct heir. I thought if the family witnessed. You thought if the family witnessed, there would be no challenge." I looked at him. "You thought I would sit in that chair and absorb it and go home, and you would move forward uncontested." He did not deny it. "I have never asked you for anything," I said. "Not once in 30 years. Not money, not the house, not the name. I just wanted you to see me as yours." I stepped back. "You had a choice every single day for 30 years. You made it. You made it again tonight." I picked up my bag and I turned to Douglas. "Are you ready?" I asked. He nodded. "Your aunt wants to speak with you, and I think there are a few cousins in the back who are on your side." I looked out at the room. My cousin Becca was already walking toward me. Behind her, several others were standing. Not my father's audience anymore. Mine. That night, after the dinner, after the restaurant slowly emptied and my father sat alone at the head of a table full of untouched birthday cake, I drove to a park near my apartment and sat on a bench until 2 in the morning. The city was quiet. Orwell was with me. I had picked him up on the way, needing something warm and uncomplicated. I sat with the weight of the evening and tried to understand what I was feeling. People use the word relief incorrectly most of the time. They say it like it means happiness, like it means the absence of pain. What I felt that night was different. Relief, the real kind, is what happens when a thing you have been bracing against for years finally arrives, and you realize you survived it. It does not feel like joy. It feels like putting down a very heavy object you had forgotten you were carrying. I had been carrying Conrad Callahan's version of me for 31 years. The obedient daughter. The measured, appropriate, correctly behaved extension of a name and an estate. The quiet child who learned early not to ask the wrong questions. I had carried that so long I had mistaken it for my own shape. It was not my shape. It had never been my shape. The following days moved quickly. Gloria confirmed that my legal position regarding the estate was solid. The adoption record was unambiguous. Conrad's attempt to use the DNA test as grounds for disinheritance had a fundamental flaw he had overlooked in his certainty. He had legally made me his daughter. That act superseded biology in the eyes of the law. His attorney contacted Gloria within 48 hours. There was no aggression in the communication. No threats. Just a quiet, expedient desire to resolve things without further escalation. Particularly, Gloria noted with a small professional smile, given the footage that currently existed. I did not weaponize the footage. I want to be clear about that. Douglas had contacts and he had leverage, but the goal had never been destruction. The goal had been truth. And truth had done its own work that evening without any additional assistance. My mother filed for separation 4 days after the dinner. She moved into a hotel initially and then into a furnished apartment across the city. She called me on the 6th day. The conversation was short and careful. We were two people who had been in the same story for 30 years and were only now meeting each other honestly for the first time. "I owe you more than a phone call," she said. "You do," I agreed. "I would like the chance to offer it, if you are willing." I thought about it. "I am not ready for that yet. I understand. But I am not saying no permanently," I added. "I am saying not yet." She accepted that. I respected her for accepting it without pushing. Douglas and I had dinner the following week. He brought photographs. Pictures of Rosalind as a young woman. She had my jawline and my habit, apparently, of collecting too many plants. He told me stories about her that were small and ordinary, and therefore the most precious things anyone had ever given me. Stories about a person rather than a myth. I learned that Rosalind had thought about me every single day, that she had kept a journal for 30 years addressed to me, that it was in Douglas's possession and it was mine whenever I wanted it. I told him I wanted it. That evening, I sat in my apartment with Orwell asleep on my feet and the journal in my hands. The handwriting on the first page was the same careful, looping script as the letter Helen had given me. My biological mother's voice. Quiet. Waiting. I turned to the first entry. It was dated the day she gave me up. "I want you to know," it began, "that choosing to give you a life I could not provide was the hardest and most loving thing I have ever done. And I want you to know, wherever you are, and whoever you have become, that you were wanted. You were always wanted." I held that journal for a long time before I turned the page. 3 weeks after the birthday dinner, I received a certified letter. It was from Conrad Callahan's attorney. Formal, precise, and almost admirably brief. It informed me that Conrad Callahan wished to relinquish all contest of my standing as a legal heir to the Callahan estate, effective immediately, and that his team would be in contact with Gloria Trent to arrange the relevant documentation. I read it twice. Then I set it down on my kitchen table and made coffee. I had expected to feel something large when this moment arrived. Triumph, perhaps, or closure. The cinematic swell of a victory earned. What I felt instead was something smaller and more permanent. A quiet settling. The kind of feeling you get when the last piece of an incomplete puzzle slides into place, and the image turns out to be simpler than you expected. Gloria called an hour later. They moved fast, she said. The footage helped, I said. The footage helped enormously, she agreed. I would also note that 3 regional journalists have been making inquiries this week. Conrad's team is highly motivated to make this disappear quietly. Good, I said. Let it disappear quietly. I do not need it to be loud. Gloria was silent for a beat. Most people in your position want the public moment. I had the public moment, I said. 75 people watched my father dismantle himself in the room he designed for my humiliation. That is enough. I meant it. I had not gone to that dinner to destroy Conrad Callahan. I had gone because he left me no alternative. He had constructed a stage and lit it and handed me a role I did not choose. But the story that played out on that stage was not his. It was mine. And it had said everything it needed to say. Conrad did not contact me directly. I did not expect him to, and I did not want him to. What he had done over 31 years was not the kind of thing a phone call addresses. He was not a villain in a simple story. He was a man who had spent his entire life choosing power over people and had arrived at the natural consequence of that choice. I did not hate him. I did not forgive him. I simply accepted that he had existed in my life as an incomplete figure and that he would remain that way. What I focused on instead was Rosalind. I read her journal over the course of 2 weeks, slowly, a few pages at a time. It was the most intimate thing I had ever experienced. A woman I had never met had written to me for 30 years. She had told me about her day, about her work, about the small things she noticed that she thought I might find interesting, about the grief she carried, about the way she had learned, slowly and with enormous effort, to live alongside that grief rather than inside it. She had written about hope, about the belief that I was somewhere being cared for and loved, about the possibility that one day, when the time was right, we might find each other. We never did. Not in the way she imagined. She died before the time became right, but she had left me her words. And her words were so full of her that reading them felt like knowing her, felt like being known by her. Douglas and I met for coffee every few weeks. He was teaching me things about Rosalind in the way that only siblings know their siblings, the irritating habits, the specific humor, the way she laughed too loudly at her own jokes. I was collecting her piece by piece and building her into something real. One evening, while we were walking back to our cars after dinner, Douglas stopped and looked at me. "She would have liked you," he said. "I hope so," I said. "She would have loved you," he corrected. "There is a difference. She would have liked who you are. She would have loved you simply because you exist." I did not say anything. I just stood there on that quiet street and let that sentence do what it needed to do. It was the first time in 31 years that I had allowed myself to believe it. It has been 8 months since the birthday dinner that was designed to erase me. I am still a landscape architect. I still have too many plants. Orwell still distrusts strangers, which I still deeply respect. My life looks largely the same from the outside. But I am different. I spent 30 years trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided I did not belong. I bent myself into shapes that were not mine. I asked smaller questions than I deserved answers to. I accepted the version of myself that Conrad Callahan offered me because I did not yet know I was allowed to refuse it. I know now. The thing I carry from all of this is not the victory in that restaurant, or the legal resolution, or even the journal full of my biological mother's voice. The thing I carry is simpler than any of that. You are not defined by who chose to see you. You are defined by who you choose to be once you finally stop waiting. That is the whole story. If this resonated with you, please subscribe and hit the bell icon for more stories like this one. Drop a comment below. I read every single one. The next story is already waiting. And I promise you, it is going to shake you to your core.